welcome to your BPCC-102 Unit 1. In this particular unit, we will be discussing the introduction to biopsychology. So we will be learning about all the foundational concepts that are related to biopsychology, and we will try to learn about how the field emerged and how it has developed over the period of time. So let's get into the objective for this particular lesson. So today we will be focusing on the nature and scope of biopsychology, as well as different divisions of biopsychology, research methods in biopsychology. All right, so I hope you are all interested and I hope you are all ready for an exciting lesson ahead. Now, let me ask you one small question before we start. What do you think biopsychology is? What do you think makes biopsychology biopsychology? I mean, there must be a lot of thoughts that might be coming to your mind right now. You might be thinking, okay, this is a multidisciplinary field, or it's a multi-factor field, or maybe it has something to do with biology of psychology or psychology of biology, right? So let me resolve those queries, but I do want you to go ahead and read the definition of biopsychology on the APA site, American Psychological Association. Go do that, so it'll give you an interesting definition and insight about the subject. All right, so when we talk about the field biopsychology, it is defined as an integration of two disciplines, which is biology and psychology. So over here, see, biopsychology didn't emerge overnight. So we know that, when we talk about biochemical aspects or biological or anatomical aspects of behavior, they were all rooted into neuroscience. Okay, so they were rooted into neuroscience, and a closely related field of neuroscience is biopsychology. So biopsychology is something that comes under or came from neuroscience, where neuroscience focused on studying the anatomy, biochemical processes, and physiology of our nervous system. And something which is closely related to this was biopsychology. Now, biopsychology is particularly a biological approach to the study of human and animal behavior. Remember that psychology is not related to just human behavior, it's also related to animal behavior. Hence, biopsychology is particularly a study which focuses on this approach. So it has a biological approach. What do I mean by biological approach over here? What happens inside my body? That's what I'm trying to understand. What happens inside my body which makes me behave in a certain way? The fact that I am able to talk to you right now or think right now, how is that happening? How is that process taking place? So that entire process takes place when biological, certain aspects of our biology also engage, right? You might have always heard this thing that, that illness is hereditary. Or when we talk about autism, we also talk about the fact that it can be transferred through genes. What are genes? They're a biological unit. So this is why understanding how biology affects our behavior becomes equally important. All right. So when we talk about biopsychology, it is important to remember the true nature of the subject and how it emerged. So we know that this is the scientific study of human and animal behavior through a biological approach. Now let's get into the nature and scope of biopsychology. So when we talk about nature and scope of biopsychology, one of the most prominent individuals in this field was Donald Olding Hebbs. So he lived from 1904 to 1985, and he was someone who really pushed this subject to its extreme. Where the subject is standing now, Hebb proposed in 1949 whatever he proposed about. So in the organization of behavior in 1945, in the field of psychology and neuroscience, he paved the way for future investigation of neural foundations of behavior. So he proposed the neural foundations of behavior. We know what neural foundations are, right? These are neural systems or neurons. This is referred to the nerve cells or cells of our nervous system. This is all referred to as neural system. Okay, so he proposed that neural systems must be investigated to understand or gather a true picture of our behavior, right, through a biological perspective. Now, over here, whatever he proposed in 1945 has been applied in the current time. So, if you look at fields such as cognitive science, engineering, robotics, psychology, neuroscience, neurophysiology, all these fields come from where? From these propositions which were made by Hebbs. All right. So, biopsychologists over the period of time have tried to investigate scientifically how biological process interact with cognition, emotions, and psychological processes. So, the nature of biopsychology is pretty simple, right? That over here, the entire discipline is based on understanding scientifically something which is observable, measurable, and standardized. Okay, understanding scientifically how the body processes all your biological elements are connected with your cognition, emotions, and different other psychological process, let's say your motivation, your memory. And remember that all these we did in BPCC 101 when we were learning about psychology, right? So how all the psychological process are connected with biopsychology or our biological elements. Okay. Moving ahead forward, when we talk about nature and scope of biopsychology, so it is a discipline of neuroscience as we discussed, and it's closely related to neuroscience. So there are few of the disciplines of neuroscience which are particularly relevant for biopsychology. Okay, so why are these relevant is primarily because they further build the scope for biopsychology. So if you want, you know what scope is, right? How far a subject can go. So to understand how far a subject can go, we must know its history and its elements, right? So when we talk about the subject of neuroanatomy, it is the study of the structure of nervous system. Now we discussed in our introduction that block 2 is something where we will be covering up the nervous system. Then comes neurochemistry. So it is the study of chemical aspects of nervous activity. How do you think that messages get passed on in our body? This is something that we'll discuss, but I just want you to ponder upon. How do you think messages get passed on in the body? How does sensation happen? Perception happen? This is all we discussed in the previous BPCC 101, right? So, how is that happening? Through chemical relays. So, that is something which we will learn. But neurochemistry is something that focuses on this element. Then we have neuropathology. So, when we talk about neuropathology, this is the study of disorder of nervous system. So, any disorder which happens in your nervous system. Then we have neuroendocrinology. So, endocrinology is the study of interaction between your nervous system and your endocrine system. So endocrine system is the hormonal system in your body. All right. Then we have neuropharmacology. So this focuses on studying the impact of drugs on neural activity. And then we have our neurophysiology. And this primarily studies the function and activities of your nervous system. So what all can you see over here? That there are a wide variety of neural foundations within the field of biopsychology. All these subjects, all these aspects of neuroscience come under or in one way or another are connected with biopsychology. So this tells us that the field of biopsychology is diverse and has many branches which contribute to neuroscience. So the research, again, this is something that you have to focus on as a psychologist. Whatever field you choose to practice on, counseling, industrial, clinical, you would always be a researcher as well. Why? Because you would have to take in that role time and time again. Okay. So when we talk about research, so research which is conducted in biopsychology also varies from perspectives to perspective, depending on which particular field is going to be our focus. So biopsychology research is often conducted on human as well as non-human participants, but most of the non-human participants consist of your mice, rats, and sometimes cats and dogs or other primates such as chimpanzee or orangutans. All right. So you might remember all these experiments from your coursework 1, which we had discussed, right? So those are all the elements that come in the research of biopsychology. So let's understand that through this research, what is biopsychology trying to do? So, biopsychology research or biopsychology in itself aims to understand how the brain has evolved and how that evolution has led an influence on the behavior. This is why sometimes we do studies on primates. You know who primates are, right? Chimpanzees or orangutans, the gorillas, who are the closest species to us humans, right? So we are Homo sapiens. Before us, there were a generation of humans, and we are the most evolved human, right? So our brain is different, but our uh, predecessors were chimpanzees and gorillas, right? So these are certain things that we can focus on. So this is why biopsychology also tries to understand the evolution of brain and how that evolution in the size and in the weight of the brain has led to a change in our behavior. Okay, next is focuses on the development of nervous system across the lifespan. Now, you know, when a kid is born, it doesn't start doing all the activities instantly, right? It takes time to learn to talk, to walk. Every action takes time. How are those actions happening? So as the child is growing, the functions that he or she can perform are also growing, right? And how are these functions performed? They are performed through your nervous system. Okay, so this is why biopsychology also focuses and emphasizes on studying the evolution or the development of nervous system over the period of lifespan. So once you take birth, from conception to your old age. All right. Then biopsychology also tries to understand the areas of brain which are involved in sensation, perception, memory, movement. So these four elements are the most widely studied elements that focus on understanding biopsychology, or that drive the field more, right? So when we talk about brain, biopsychology is not the only field that studies brain and concepts related to it through a multidisciplinary approach. We also have neuropsychology and cognitive science, which follow a similar ideology. Okay. Next, the aim of biopsychology is also to understand the role of brain in emotional expression and regulation, language and cognition. So everything that often is done by brain becomes the focus of this particular subject. And lastly, it tries to understand how behavioral change occurs after brain damage or trauma. So there are famous cases where we have heard that somebody's personality changed after they were in, let's say after they had exhibited or they had gotten a stroke. Or you might remember the famous case where a person had undergone a rod went inside the eye, and after that the person's personality changed completely. Some parts of our brain stop functioning after certain trauma, right? So this is what the field also tries to focus on, that how does brain damage affects our behavior, which again allows us to understand how the particular part of brain was contributing to our functioning. Okay, now when we primarily talk about, this is something that I would like you to remember, when we talk about research in biopsychology, there could be two types. You have your pure research and applied research. So pure research is known as a basic or fundamental research, and it is conducted without any prior aim or goal. So you won't have a prior aim or goal over here, and this is exploratory in nature. So you would often explore different elements as and when you are discovering, and this is often driven by your own intuition and interest. So you were feeling that this concept could be like this, more let's say that you had an insight about something and you want to confirm it. So that is where pure research comes into place, whereas applied research is conducted with the prior aim, because it starts with the aim to solve an existing problem, and hence it is descriptive in nature and often has practical implication. Now why I was telling you about these type of research is because when we talk about the field of biopsychology, there is a lot of research which is done. At times the focus could be just trying to discover which part of brain connects to what psychological process, but that itself has to come from somewhere, right? So in that case, when a scientist or a researcher has an insight, they might often follow that insight and see that, okay, how do we really think? Where do thoughts stay? Where is language in the brain, right? All these questions are something that come to the mind and they try to answer. And in applied research, as I gave the example of pathology, so let's say we have discovered that, okay, this area or this damage to this area of the brain causes this pathology. Now what will I try to do? Develop interventions, treatment plans, understand the pathology more. Okay, so hence it is more descriptive in nature. All right, so this is all about your nature and scope of biopsychology. Now let's focus on your divisions of biopsychology. So when we talk about divisions in biopsychology, so there are 6 main divisions that are in biopsychology. Understand that this is a field which is further divided into subfields. Okay, so when we talk about divisions in biopsychology, we have physiological psychology. Now physiological psychology uses controlled experimental conditions to stimulate the brain and study its effect on behavior. Now, this involves direct manipulation and then understanding the brain. So, the primary aim here is to develop theories about how neural mechanisms control the behavior. All right. And next we have psychopharmacology. So, psychopharmacology is mainly focused on understanding and studying the interaction between brain and behavior. However, the majority of experiments are applied in nature. They focus on developing therapeutic drugs and reducing the drug use of an individual. Okay. Next we have is neuropsychology. Now you have, up until now gotten an idea about biopsychology, and we learned about different fields in terms of neuroscience and how they are connected with biopsychology. So neuropsychologists specifically study the patients who have had some head injury or trauma or are suffering from brain damage. So over here, the psychologist would help in diagnosing the impairment and working out a suitable treatment for dealing with it. Now, this is a field which is particularly focused on understanding the suffering of the patients as well as where they are coming from, what are the elements or aspects of their functioning that have been impaired. All right, now moving ahead, next we have psychophysiology. So when we talk about psychophysiology, this as a field uses non-invasive techniques to examine the relationship between physiological activity and psychological processes such as your attention, learning, memory, emotions. All right. So over here, the focus is on understanding physiology, the body of an individual, the bodily functions of an individual, to understand the psychological processes that are connected with it. Okay. Next, we have is cognitive neuroscience. So when I talk about cognitive neuroscience, this is a study or a field which is primarily focused with the neural basis of cognition and higher order cognitive processes. So this includes understanding concepts such as thinking, memory, attention, and other perceptual process to understand how these actions are taking in place. Okay. We often use fMRI to understand the brain activity and further form our conclusions about the functioning of the human brain. All right. Next, we have is comparative psychology. So, comparative psychology often focuses on studying the behavior of different species to understand their behavior from evolutionary, genetic, and adaptation perspective. So, over here, the behavior could have been studied in a laboratory or it might be observed in a natural environment. And this is often known as ethological research when you are doing it in a natural environment. Okay. So the researcher is most concerned with understanding how we have evolved. So a researcher might, study our behavior in social setting with behavior of gorillas, apes, and orangutans. All right. Okay, they might also study a dolphin's behavior in connection with social communities to human behavior in social community because we have close IQs. All right, so this is one of the reasons why this happens. Okay, so these were the 6 divisions of biopsychology. Now coming to the research methods or biopsychology. We discussed that biopsychology is one field which is filled with research. And if you ever choose to become a biopsychologist, research is going to be one of the major part of your life as well as your scope of work. So over here, there are different methods to study biopsychology, each one of which we will be doing. Now, when we talk about biopsychology's research, as I said earlier, that this sometimes involves non-human patients and sometimes it involves human subjects. So it's a wide variety which you get in terms of participants as well as what you will be studying. But some of the techniques are, now again, research methods could be divided into invasive and non-invasive. Invasive is where you will be cutting open a part of the body or the brain. So it involves you to invade the species. But non-invasive is that without forming any, intentional or unintentional harm, you try to study the behavior. Okay. So we have techniques such as ablation method, histological methods, electrical stimulation, psychophysiological recording methods, neuroimaging, stereotaxic lesions, chemical stimulation, and these are the few methods of research in biopsychology. Now let's start our discussion with the ablation method. Why understanding ablation method is important? So when we talk about the ablation method, this is one of the invasive techniques, all right? And it is further divided into 4 techniques. So you can do ablation through different aspects is what we are trying to convey over here. So we will be discussing those types further, but just a brief, there are 5 in total. We have aspiration, nerve poison, cryogenic blockade, knife cuts, and radio frequency. Okay, so when we talk about ablation, what does ablation means? So ablation means removing a brain area through a surgical knife and destroying some tissue of the brain. So this follows the reverse method of research where you try to affect a part of the brain and see what function is being impaired or what behavioral change is happening. Okay, so this is followed by assessing the changes that, as I said, which occur in the behavior because of the removal or destruction of the tissue. Let's say if you removed some part from my left hemisphere, now you as a researcher would like to see what all aspects or what all things in my behavior have changed. Okay, that is what happens in ablation method. We will discuss different forms of ablation, but I hope you have understood what happens over here. So see, both ablation and lesion methods are invasive and involve cutting a part of the brain. Now, lesion method is a type of ablation method, okay? So they are both correlated. So they work in parallel, right? They're similar entities. Okay. So ablation method involves, as I said, destroying that some tissue of the brain, and then we assess the changes in behavior. So hence any wound or injury is known as lesion. That's why they are the same. Okay. So see, over here, a researcher has to be really careful and highly trained. If you are someone who wants to do research through ablation method, you will have to be extremely trained in the process of surgery because you cannot cause harm to any other tissue or area of the brain. This is why, because brains, everything is interconnected, right? So even if there is a small damage, it can completely affect, even if you were trying to destroy some part of my left hemisphere, but accidentally you destroyed some from connections from right hemisphere. Now you won't know what is causing what, right? Why are there changes in the behavior, because of what? So this is why it is must that you have to make sure that you are well versed in surgery, and people who often perform such researches are given surgical training. Okay, now let's discuss different methods through which you can do ablation. So first we have is aspiration. So when we talk about aspiration, this is a technique where a fine needle is placed on the brain tissue. So the tissue can be seen by surgeon and is accessible by the surgical instrument, and they place the needle on the tissue which needs to be examined, and then it is aspirated and the contents are placed on a slide So if you have ever gone in a biology lab, they have these glass slides where they put the tissue and then they check it under the microscope, or whatever they would like to do further with it. Okay, if they are looking for a microscopic explanation, that's what they do. However, the contents whatever are placed on the site and examined for diagnostic analysis. So this is a preferred technique when they want to understand a part of the cortical tissue which has to be removed to reveal the area which is under for further investigation. So cortical tissue is the most primary layer. Okay, so let's say if somebody has to remove that layer and then see what is much more deeper, if they want to access a different part of the brain which comes under it, that is when we often use aspiration. Okay, next is radio frequency. Now when we talk about radio frequency, also called as RF, this is used to produce subcortical lesions. Okay, now we know what lesions is, right? Any part which is injured or wounded. So over here what happens in, a wire is placed on the tissue which has to be examined, and then the radio frequency device will produce a high current. Okay, so a high frequency current would be given and the heat will destroy the tissue. So the duration and intensity of the current would ultimately determine the size and the shape of lesion. So the bigger the duration, the bigger the size, right? Okay, so that is what radio frequency is. Lesion through current. Then comes your knife cuts or sectioning. So when we talk about sectioning or cutting, this is used to make a cut on any area of the nerves or the brain. So see, aspiration, thin needle, radio frequency, current, knife cuts is cutting or sectioning. So here a special device is used to make subcortical knife cuts, and very carefully you would place a stereotaxic apparatus. So a stereotaxic apparatus is used in ablation. This keeps the organism on the table as well as make sure that you are only accessing the area which needs to be caused a lesion. Okay, so by using such a technique, extensive damage whatever would happen to the surrounding is decreased. What would happen in your radio frequency if I were to give a radio frequency to, let's say, a mice or a rat's part of a brain? What are the chances that the current would also go to other parts if not insulated or isolated? High chances, right? Which means that I might never know why a behavioral change had happened. Okay, so this is why knife cutting is considered as one of the safest method to make sure that you're decreasing the chances of damage to other parts. All right. Next comes your cryogenic blockade. Now your cryogenic blockade is something which we talks about a temporary way of inducing a lesion. Over here, a cryoprobe. See, what is a cryoprobe? It's basically a coolant. Okay, it will freeze your brain, or that wherever you will touch it, it will completely freeze it for that particular time period. So a cryoprobe is placed in the brain, and through this tube, a coolant is sent to the area whichever you are trying to study. Okay, so it's a device through which you will be sending the coolant. Now the coolant reduces the temperature at the tip so that it goes in such a negative temperature that the neurons stop sending any impulse which could be. So basically it becomes a lesion for a temporary period of time. It is reversible. Okay, and once the temperature is restored, neurons start functioning again. So over here temperature is maintained at above freezing point, so no structural damage is caused and things can be reversed. All right, lastly we have nerve poison. So when we talk about nerve poison over here, there are few chemicals that are used such as ascenic acid or ibotenic acid. So this would create lesion by poisoning that particular part or area of the brain. So these are chemicals which are inserted through a glass tube, and this glass tube is called a cannula. Okay, and the destruction is only partial, which is to the cell bodies. Okay, so if there is any change in behavior, it is attributed to the cell bodies and not the nerves. All right, so I hope with this it's clear. Now what I want you to think is, which one do you think is the most effective technique of doing ablation? Now remember, any technique that you opt for in ablation, or if you choose to become a biopsychologist and opt for non-invasive techniques, now they have become very less in number, but still certain studies do require you would need to have a solid rational as in a reason as to why you are planning to do this. Okay. Apart from that, think about it in the context of what is the aim for the study. So even when you take a look at these 5 techniques, try to understand that what would you try to study and how much damage is required. So the bigger, as some parts would require big lesion, some would require small lesion. So depending on that, a scientist decides which method to use. Okay. Now that'll be all for our today's lesson. And a quick recap of what we did. We learned about the definition of biopsychology. Along with that, we learned the nature and scope of the subject. Further, we learned the divisions in this field and we tried to understand one of the research methods. So that will be all for today. In the next lesson, we will be moving forward with this particular chapter. I hope you are all having a great lesson. Do watch some videos on ablation methods as well as look up some diagrams. It would be quite interesting, but it can be a little gross if you get grossed out by biological or surgical things. Okay, but I'm giving you all a trigger warning ahead, so make sure you engage in the content that you can handle, right? So, but do check out these surgical methods. If not videos, you can check out the diagrams of a stereotaxic apparatus. It would greatly help you in understanding the concept. Make sure you keep reading and keep learning. That's all for now, and see you in the next lesson. Take care.